welcome to the Planning Committee on Wednesday the 18th of July 2018, and welcome particularly to our guests. We're having two sessions today, members, the public who've come, and also those who are watching on the webcast. Today we're going to tackle two subjects which are very important in terms of underpinning the new London plan, and it's to help prepare this committee, which represents the Assembly at the examination in public of the London plan later this year. The two topics are the strategic housing market assessment and the management of density. And we've divided our meeting into two sessions, and we're starting with the strategic housing market assessment. But before we do that, I'd like our committee clerk, Teresa, to just take us through the business so we can just get that out of the way and then deal with these two meaty topics.
Thank you, Chair. Members of the public may like to follow the committee on Twitter at London Assembly and take part in the discussion on social media using hashtag Assembly Planning.
So do take part on Twitter, please, audience.
The first item of business is apologies for absence, and there are none today. And then the next item is declarations of interest. Can I ask members to note the list of offices held by Assembly members as set out at agenda item 2, and ask Assembly members if they have any other interest to declare?
Noted.
That's no other interest, thank you. Can I ask members to agree the minutes of the meeting held on the 27th of June 2018?
Agreed.
Thank you. Summary list of actions, item 4. Can I ask members to note the ongoing and completed list of actions? Thank you. Now, just to let you know, there's a change of agenda items, as the Chair said. In accordance with Standing Order 2.2d, the Chair has agreed to take the agenda items in a different order to that set out in the agenda. We'll finish off the formal items of business and then revert to agenda item 6, followed by agenda item 5. So moving on to item 7, the Planning Committee's work programme for 2018-2019. Can I ask the committee please to note the updated work programme as set out in the report?
Noted.
To delegate authority to the Chair in consultation with the Deputy Chair to agree the main agenda items for the committee's meetings from November 2018 until the end of the Assembly year.
Agreed.
Thank you. And note a likely proposal for a rapporteur review that will be submitted to the next meeting of the committee as set out in paragraph 4.4 of the report, sorry.
Agreed.
And the date of the next meeting of the committee is scheduled for Thursday the 6th of September at 2:30 p.m. in this room, Committee Room 5 at City Hall. And there is no other items of urgent business that have been notified to the Chair. And so I hand back to the Chair for item 6.
Thank you. We're now to open the session on the strategic housing market assessment, which is the evidence base for housing policies in the housing strategy and in the draft new London plan. And it's an important evidence base, and we're particularly focusing in this meeting on not only how it meets London's housing needs in terms of household types and in terms of tenures, but particularly on the backlog of need, affordability, and whether we think it actually is doing the business that we want. I'm going to introduce our guests in a moment. I just want to say that two of our guests have had really serious unforeseen circumstances in the last day or two, so they're not able to be with us. However, we are seeing this session as also about raising questions. It's really impossible to answer all the questions that we have about the strategic housing market assessments, which I'm going to call the Smale from now on, if you don't mind. And we think, therefore, that we're likely to follow up with informal conversations and further work, and we'll bring in our other two guests then, and they have also briefed Peter Kenway, who is going to deal with most of this session. Now, I would just like to ask you, before we kick off, those people who are around this table, to just turn to the back, the Appendix 1 in your briefing paper at the back, which sets out the SHMA for 2017, which is the one we're mainly talking about today, and the previous SHMA for 2013. And you will see there, I mean, the previous one said that we required 49,000 homes per annum until 35. This one says that we need, annualised, we need 66,000, I'm rounding up, homes per annum until 2041. The big change between the two, apart from the growth in numbers, is that the biggest bit of growth, and it's very laudable and welcome, is in the social, as well, in the affordable sector, and particularly the social rented sector, and we're very pleased about that. However, most of it is taken up with one-bed flats, and that's going to be part of what we really want to interrogate today. And you will see that the market housing between the two SHMAs is really static. It hasn't grown in numbers. What's changed is the growth in one-bed flats in the market sector and the decrease in 2- and 3-bed flats. Slight increase in 4-bed. In the affordable sector, what you see is a rocketing increase in one-bed flats and family housing remaining exactly the same in numbers, therefore in proportion much lower, than in the first SHMA. And that's all I wanted to say to set the scene. But these two SHMAs are providing, it's this evidence that we really want to interrogate. And now I'm going to hand over to Peter and to open. And it would be good, Peter, if you could just say a little bit about the New Policy Institute, because you have responded to the London Plan, and therefore you might want to frame what you're going to say by saying us a bit about the focus of your response.
Nikki, thank you very much. Yes, I will make that. In some ways, we're intruders in the debate around the strategic housing market assessment, in that we came in here almost by accident. I don't mean here today, but into this subject. MPI, since it began, has been privileged to be the researchers and authors of the London Poverty Profile, which is published by Trust for London. And if you like, off the back of the last London Poverty Profile, 2017, last year, we looked at the plan, we looked at the Mayor's vision of a city for all Londoners, and essentially we responded to that plan by arguing excellent, but in order to make sure that that happens, you need to lean in, if you will, on behalf of low-income Londoners. That in some sense, if the processes work the way they do, unless you make almost a positive effort, the likelihood is that low-income Londoners, for a whole variety of reasons, might lose out. So that was where we came into the plan, and then our attention to the strategic housing market assessment was really prompted through conversations with yourselves around these concerns around why have the number of one-bed flats, the number of one-bed units increased so much. And we've done some very simple analysis of the SHMA to try to understand that. The fact that simple analysis seems to shed light is probably worrying. The other point I'd make is that I'm speaking also, answering on behalf of Robin Smale of Vivid Economics. He's also submitted a paper, and since he can't be here, I've reviewed it, and I'm very happy to speak on his behalf. But in some sense, that emphasises the point that we are at best only slightly better informed on these matters than you are yourselves.
Okay, I think that's because, well, on the back of that, we want to be raising the questions that we think still we don't have the data on, that we would like to be answered. And I'd like, members to think about questions that we think need answering, as well as our two guests. Steve, would you just like to say a word about Ipsos Mori?
Yes, so I represent Ipsos Mori. I am a research director there, and I head up the housing team. We are a full-service primary research agency. Likewise feel a little bit of an interloper, but I've been given the last couple of days to have a look and maybe from an independent viewpoint comment on the use of the English Housing Survey to inform some of the estimates made in the Smale. So I think I can certainly raise some queries. I don't necessarily have all of the answers, but hopefully I can contribute to some of that debate.
We're very glad you've come because, of course, Ipsos Mori has done quite a lot of work on the English Housing Survey. So you know quite a lot about it. So, Peter, if we can kick off with you with the opening question, which is really to look at the way the forecast is done, and it's the opening question really is asking you whether you think going back 10 years is a sufficient amount of time in terms of trends and data for this sort of evidence base.
To begin with, I'm therefore answering on behalf of Robin, who argues that in their paper that these are correctly relatively short-term trends in migration, and to take short-term trends as a basis for long-term projections is obviously a cause for some concern. The point he makes, and I'm going to elaborate on this, is it presents a rather narrow range of estimates. And that's going to be one of my key points here, really, where I strongly agree with them that one of the problems with this is that one is very likely underestimating the possible the range of possible outcomes. Now, it is important, I think your 10-year point is a very important one. It is insufficiently understood what has happened to our population, and I'm now talking about the UK, not just London, since 2004. Migration is one part of that, a rapidly ageing population is another. And therefore, to take trends back to 2004 is in fact to look at an extremely unusual period in history. You have to go back to before the First World War to find a period when the population grew as fast. So I think your concern that 10 years isn't sufficient is correct. And I'm old enough to remember a time in the early 1980s when we were planning inside London transport on the basis that the population was falling. It is not at all impossible. These things go through cycles. The range of possible outcomes is considerable. What we need the forecast to do is to narrow them down, but not to a single point.
What do you think are the risks then of that?
I think there are two risks. I think one is obviously that you end up with a plan that is wrong. In some sense, every forecast is wrong. You have to have a sense of the possible field of outcomes. But I think the other danger, which in a way is a bigger one for you and for us as Londoners, is that if you don't recognise that there's a range, it looks like there's very little you can do about it. Your problem is to meet the target. The reality is the target is A, highly uncertain, and B, dependent not on policy today or tomorrow, but over this period on policy too. There are choices. There isn't complete freedom, but there also isn't no freedom. And I think a forecast that doesn't offer that sense that there are a range of possibilities turns what is a social and properly a political decision into apparently a technical one, which it is not.
Very interesting. What about the amount of the trends going forward? Have they, has the Smale allowed enough time in its assessment for those?
How do you mean? Has it
It's
gone far enough into the future?
Yes, it's going forward to 41, but is it looking more closely just at the
Actually,
next 10 years?
I think that's a very good question. It's completely uncertain what's happening in 41. It's not clear to me that it's therefore any more uncertain what's happening in 61. I think it's a good question. What would it look like? What if the Smale unfolds and the population develops? What's it going to look like in 41? Which is sadly not, it's not that far away. Are you actually setting up something that looks like it will be at least on the right sort of track, even beyond that? Because if it's not right in 41, if it's not right going forward, it will become clearer much earlier. So I think as part of this wider look, wider range of options, there is an argument even for thinking about what might happen beyond, understanding that the uncertainties grow rapidly as time goes forward.
Yes, we've got well, I just wanted to add in here that I know the ONS projections, Office of National Statistics suggestions, do go up and down enormously. But haven't they just come out with some new projections?
They have come out with a projection. So the projection, I'm happy to be corrected, the projection I think on which the plan is based and the SHMA is based is basically something like 70,000 a year population. The new figures, which are only like Monday or something, aren't they, or this week or the end of last week, I think, although there's obviously a bit of fluctuation, I think is about 29,000 a year lower. In other words, around 41,000 a year, which if you add that up, says that instead of a growth of, is it something like 1.75 million by about 2040, is more like 1 million. So getting on for a halving of the estimate. Now, this I think is a measure of, it's one sign of the uncertainty. You mustn't assume that the latest numbers are correct and the ones last week are wrong. It doesn't work like that. There could be another revision in 2 years' time or sooner which does something else. But I think it is a sign of the vast uncertainty, the even greater uncertainty that there is now post the referendum and the prospects of Brexit. And so I think this sense of what's the range and what happens if we're wrong, what happens if the population does something different from what we expect, then but we follow the SHMA, what's going to happen? And that sort of looking at sort of what happens if things go wrong is what you can very reasonably be asking the sort of the planning experts to look at, because one wants a degree of resilience in there if things go off track.
So are you suggesting that one should have, we're moving on to question 2 in a moment, but just suggesting then that that there should be scenarios, ranges, whether one's looking, building on what's gone before and looking forward?
Yes, I think so.
Because what we're trying to get out of this is next steps, and what would be the final question is about what would be the shopping list of things you would want either explored or changed in the SHMA.
I think 3 scenarios, if you like, are sort of a higher, middle, and based on the population, high, middle, low growth would be the sort of the obvious way to go forward. Which raises one interesting question, whether the SHMA at the minute is actually the high growth one, or whether there's actually some scenarios when it could even reasonably be higher. I don't know. But I think looking at some different scenarios would be wise.
Right. And would you expect there to be, if the SHMA remains as it is at the moment, would you expect there to be reviews?
Well, inevitably.
Timely reviews, yes. We're getting new household projections in September.
So we'll see. We'll see how that plays out. But this is a big change in the population forecast. So it must make a difference to the housing projection.
Right. Okay. I think that's enough on the opening. Tom, on this, you're doing question 2. You would want to bring Steve in on this, I think.
Yes, I've got some sort of more questions, sort of drill more down into some of the sort of assumptions contained within the SHMA. Is it reasonable for the SHMA to assume that household growth will follow the same patterns of currently, taking no account of what new residents can afford or whether existing households may be under-occupying their homes? And what are the risks with taking this approach?
What I talked with Robin a bit about this, really. It takes affordability into account in a way, but it seems to me that it doesn't take it into account in an economic way, and I think there are 2 problems with this. One is it means that if people can't afford, particularly if families can't afford to be in London, then they're assumed to be moved out. to assume to move out, and that's apparently not counted as an unmet need. So in some sense, affordability is a given in the calculation, but it's not a variable. And it ought to be a variable. The question of affordability is, issues around policies around social market rent, the bedroom tax, local housing allowance, council tax, you know what the factors are. You haven't got any room for manoeuvre at the moment, but that doesn't mean there won't be significant room for manoeuvre or innovation over the period. So I think it's a mistake. It kind of depoliticizes what is essentially a political decision if you leave affordability out of it in that way.
So, it says in our briefing, we've got in the briefing that 25 to 39-year-olds accounted for a third of all the people leaving London over the past 10 years, which could be reduced by increasing the supply, for example, of larger homes for families. Is this something that the SMAR wouldn't take into account? It would just say, oh, well, they've left, and it wouldn't then factor in things which might then encourage people to move back into London.
That's my understanding. I mean, this outmigration in those years it has long been a feature. It's a question of what its scale is. But I don't think there's any. My understanding is there's no real attempt to kind of look at what you could do to sort of reduce, not reverse it, but reduce it.
And the SMAR also assumes that, I don't know if it's all renting households, but certainly private rented households will never under-occupy. They will only occupy the size of home that they require. And it assumes that all couples only want a one-bedroom flat. Do you think that this has led to an overstatement of the need for one-bedroom flats in the SMAR?
I want to answer you here by being a bit sort of professorial. It is clear in the SMAR that under-occupation is not the same as having only the things that the bedroom standard says you need. There is a footnote, reference it if you like, that makes it clear. You're not under-occupying if you have one spare room.
You reference it for us, just so.
I will reference it. It's in my paper, and it is footnote 49 on page 82. You need to have 2 or more spare bedrooms to count as under-occupying. So a single person in a 3-bed, yes, but a single person in a 2-bed. And this was what I think of as the sort
across
of
all tenures.
Across all tenures. That was how under-occupation was measured. That's not the basis on which it's measured for the basis of the, if we can use the shorthand, the bedroom tax, which allows no spare room. But the measures of under-occupation allowed a spare room. So one mustn't, forgive me for being sort of pedantic, but because it's a huge issue. A single person in a 2-bed flat, I don't believe on that standard or a couple, I don't believe they're counted as under-occupied. They aren't under-occupied. So one mustn't merge those two things together, because I think across that boundary, the key issue is, that's really where the key issue is. But the assumption that people either only want or need that singles and couples only want a 1-bed flat across all tenures, including market tenure, is an extreme assumption. And I mean, I'm happy, maybe there might be a different, to go through it a bit later, perhaps, in the questioning. But
I just want to be clear, even in the private rented sector, you can have one spare room and you're still not under-occupied.
Yep.
Right.
Yep.
And in this...
Let me say one more thing. The bedroom standard was, as I understand it, was invented to assess overcrowding. Mm-hmm. We've got a good question coming up on that.
Yes,
about whether that's adequate. But that's what it was for. Yeah. This idea that it's also to measure under-occupation and is somehow normative as to what we ought to do is, and as far as I know, there's no basis for it. It's under-occupation. It's like a concept to try to measure overcrowding. Fine, even if we disagree with how it does it. Fine. To then turn it into its opposite is, if you like, a good concept, at the very least gone somewhere else.
We'll be coming on. We've got a question on that later, but just to again on the private rented sector, I think the SMAR, as I say, assumes that as you say, that there's a particular definition of under-occupying, but the private rented sector households won't. According to the English Housing Survey, I think 8% do, and that I think has had quite a considerable impact on the figure for one beds.
Yes, I mean the crucial thing, really. If I could just say it very, very briefly, the big rise that you referred to and is just shown in the appendix is partly driven by the big increase in the number of low cost rent properties, where the proportion of one beds was high anyway. So in some sense, if you increase that chunk, you get more one beds in the total. It's kind of like there isn't really a fundamentally different assumption in this SMAR from the last one on the low-cost rent in terms of how many one-beds as a proportion.
They have gone up from 10,000 years
yeah,
to
but that's also because the number of if you look on that table there, the number of low-cost rent has gone from 31, if I round up, from 31 to 49,000. That doesn't account for all of that rise, but there's a big increase there. The market, if you look then, if we're here on the appendix 1, there is next to no difference in the total number of market units required, 23,037 in the latest SMAR, 23,217, same number really 4 years earlier. But if you look, the one bed total has gone from 2,800 almost up to 10,700. And so that's a huge increase, which is an assumption about the mix that is required in the market sector. And I think it's fair to say, I hope I'm not putting words in his mouth, Robin Smale from Vivid Economics, the basis for that assumption is unevidenced and sort of untested.
Interesting.
and that, sorry, go on, Tom.
No, I was going to ask you the last bit about older people as well, and the assumptions there, because one of the central drivers for one-bed flats in the SMAR is older one-person households. Is there any, what evidence is given, is there any evidence given in the SMAR for whether older one-person households would wish to downsize to a one-bedroom flat? Because certainly my sort of anecdotal sort of experience would be that older people might want to downsize, but they want to downsize to a two-bedroom flat, have a spare room.
I think you should rely on your anecdotal evidence. I think that is absolutely. We did some work a few years ago around this, and this is where there's a problem with experts. We all know why, not just an old person, but in fact anybody wants and needs, and it's wise to have a spare room. People to visit, maybe you have a carer, someone living. There's a whole host of reasons. Rely on what you know. One of the problems with this wretched process is housing has been reduced to units. We're talking about homes. We're talking about things that people... And if you're an older person and are there most of the time, the quality of that and the importance of that is even greater than if you're going out to work and talking to the planning committee.
I finished on that bit, Nikki. Obviously, I can move on to 5. But did you want to?
Can I just ask one question? Isn't there a variant smuggled away in the London plan about? So here there is not exactly a railroad, but you could have this or you could have that in relation to the one-bed flats and the overcrowding, under occupation in the market sector.
You're absolutely right. There is a variant buried away. Table 15 on page 105. Now this is a variant within the same overall housing total and the same population total, but a different assumption about those one-bed flats. And if you look at that, and as I say,
this is what? Sorry, this is
table 15 in the Strategic Housing Market Assessment on page 105. And this looks to me like this got smuggled in. It seems to this sort of, it's well down the back. What is it? So this is the same total number, but this has got a different assumption about the market, a different assumption across all three tenures, market, intermediate and low. But the fundamental difference is, the big difference is in the market sector. And here I think they're making, I think the assumption, and quoting directly, are those who can afford private renters as well as homeowners continue to under-occupy their homes at current rates. And if you make that assumption, in other words, that the world, at least among those who can afford it, carries on as is, then you end up with an overall one-bed share of 41%, which compares with 55% in, if you like, the Schmar's headline total, Appendix 1, and 34% in the 2013 Schmar. So that gives a sense of how important the assumption around only occupying a one-bed unit, how important it is to the, if you like, the mainstream SHMA forecast that you have reproduced in the top table in Appendix 1.
So you could have had, I mean, do they suggest then more two beds?
Now you're asking. What do they assume? Yes, more two beds, double the number of market two beds.
So could you give us the headline figures for the other tenures? I think we've.
So why don't we? Do you want it by tenures or by one? I think what you probably want is the sort of percents of the totals.
Okay.
So if you look at what you've got there in Appendix 1. In Appendix 1, in the main chart, you've got 55% one bed. Mm-hmm. In the alternative table, Table 15, you've got 41% one bed. You've got 16% two bed are you with this?
Yeah.
Going up to 20, but 23% in the alternative.
Yeah.
14% three bed going up to 19%.
Yeah.
And 15% four bed going up to 17%.
Okay.
Now those numbers are still more shifted towards the smaller end than the 2013 Schmar, but nothing like to the same extent.
That takes you up to...
You're going to tell me I haven't got 100 there now or something?
No, it takes you up to about... No, that's fine. No, just saying that takes you up to about 36% 3 plus. Yeah.
36% 3 plus, yes, that's right, as opposed to 29%. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Still a lot less than...
And that's Table 15 from the Schmar.
That is Table 15 in the Schmar, page 105.
And that assumption, is that the one that takes into account the under-occupying...
That assumes
renters?
that those who can afford private renters as well as homeowners continue to under-occupy their homes at current rates.
Which
I would have
thought that was a reasonable assumption to make.
We would have. So, I mean, my reaction, and the great advantage of this Table 15 in the Schmar is that it's clearly kind of passes muster from a kind of technical point of view because the planning teams put it in. It does seem to me that it is, in the absence of anything else, I'd say why not that? That seems a reasonable sort of place to land, a place to start.
It assumes that homeowners won't move, but it's though the variant is actually on whether the market. I mean, homeowners is the variant. I think is in market rents.
I think
people won't move. I mean, it's stable. That there's an assumption that goes throughout that homeowners won't, who are under occupying, are not going to move. I think that's what we were told.
I think that's what we're told, and I mean we haven't dug into that.
It's 8% of market.
But it's a crucial question.
It's at 8%
Unless
of
you
market
have
rent.
policies in place to encourage people not to under-occupy, then people will continue to under-occupy, surely.
Well, if you define, if you believe in under-occupation, frankly.
Yeah.
Well, if you had policies in place, fiscal incentives and so on.
Well, they have been since I was first on a council.
In the social rented sector, there
Sorry,
are some. It's where
having a discussion.
Anyway, that's another discussion.
Yeah.
Do you want me to go...
Do I do 3 or do you want him to do 5?
Do you want me to do the English Housing Survey, or I don't mind?
I think we should do the English Housing Survey.
Okay, I'll go on to that. And I want to bring Stephen in on this one as well. What are the problems with relying on the English Housing Survey to inform housing need in the Schmar? And are there any alternatives to surveying housing need in London? So I'll go.
Start with.
I mean, I think the first thing to say is that the English Housing Survey is probably the key source of data that central government departments and research community and local practitioners use as an evidence basis. It's probably recognised as one of the most comprehensive sources of data conducted in probably the most rigorous fashion. So it's conducted by means of face-to-face interview surveying plus a property inspector going into a property. It's based on a random probability approach, so across England. So it's conducted annually on a rolling basis. So it is a high-quality means of capturing data. It captures a lot of detailed information about the household, about the property, and about individuals within that. So point one, it is probably the best source of housing data that we have available. From looking at how they've used that data in the SHMAR, it appears that they've used a London-specific sample, and they indicate 2,000 odd cases, 13,000 nationally, 2,000 in London, and they've combined that data over 3 years to presumably analyse data on the basis of 6,000 responses. That, by any stretch of the imagination, again, would be considered good, robust data to be able to analyse down to this subgroup.
Can I just ask, on the London sample, because I'm aware that sort of with opinion polls, for example, if you look at a national opinion poll and then take the London tables, they're not weighted to London, so you can't really draw any conclusions from them. Is that the same with this, or have they got a properly weighted sample for London?
That is a question that is not clear to me from reviewing the evidence. So that would definitely be a point of further investigation. The key thing I think you would want to assure yourself is that have they actually looked at this data and ensured that it is representative of the London-wide population. Absolutely critical if you're then going to base it. If they've not looked at it and not weighted it, then there's the potential that obviously you've got bias built in, which then can then have implications for the survey results. So absolutely fundamentally, that is the key question that you should be asking in terms of how they've used this data source and whether they have looked at it and weighted it to be representative of London. Absolutely.
I think that's something that we definitely should follow up on, actually. And are just on the sort of latter part, the last part of the question, are there any alternatives to surveying housing need? Are there any other data sets out there? Could we do our own? Would that be desirable?
I would so like to sit here and say absolutely you need your own another piece of primary data research. I mean, it would. Depending on how they've used that data, I think it is a comprehensive data source. It's there. It contains a lot of the information. I can talk through some other potential areas of investigation I think would warrant some further investigation. But it is there. It is existing. So actually, whether you could commission another piece of research, primary data, yes, you could make it more London specific. Whether it would give you any better quality data is questionable. And on the other side of that, of course, is the expense. It is this mechanism you want to keep with a face-to-face approach, you want to keep with sufficient sample size, doesn't come cheaply. So there are obviously cost implications of trying to do that. So yes, I would like to say what you need is a London-specific housing needs survey, and we would do it for you.
We'd be very happy to do it.
But
I have to say,
it's more a matter of a tender.
When I was Ken Living's deputy mayor, and in 2002 we commissioned our own London housing survey. And that's the last time we had one. Since then we've relied on the English housing survey. So we did do it. We should look up how much it costs.
I don't know if you heard, but we're not quite clear whether or not the English Housing Survey data that they use in London is weighted to London. So that's something we should follow up.
That's a good question.
We should follow up with the planners here, because if it's not, then it might not be quite right.
Yes.
Sorry.
Go on.
No, I was doing the backlog housing need, but if you want to come in on this.
Okay, keep going.
Sorry, Peter, do you have any comments on the English Housing Survey?
I think you have to, not on the EHS, but except that people are, I think there has to be room in this for your vision as politicians reflecting wider views and values about what you want. You can't have anything, but the way this has been set up, that there's this problem of putting people in places where they can sleep That's kind of what housing need is defined as. And this is this narrow mechanical problem without any consideration about what London will look like, or feel like, or will be here. I think it's kind of the wrong question. It's too narrow a question.
Can I just come in on that? I mean, it seems to me that I'm just an ordinary guy. I look at statistics and all the figures move around on the page, and I'm not sure what I'm looking at and what they apply, how they apply. But it seems to me that Smale measurement is a measurement of need rather than how many we should build. And isn't it the case that, for example, it says it wants to produce, there are lots of people looking for one-bedroom flats. Well, you don't have to build them. You can just produce them by building a 4-bedroom house. And then through the churn of the process, people moving into the most appropriate sized home as a result of that new resource, you get a 1-bedroom house because the family of 3 that were a flat, you get the family of 3 that were living there move out into their more appropriately sized property. I mean, is it that are we looking at too much that these are things that need to be built rather than this is a representation of desire and need?
It does feel very mechanical to me, which I think is perhaps saying yes to your, is this kind of what needs to be built. I mean, the housing market, and most of it is a market, I'm not going to say it's going to sort itself out, but it's certainly quite fluid. This does feel quite a narrow answer, perhaps a narrow answer to a too narrow a question, I think. And I think what you want London to look like is a key question. I'm not sure what London looks like, both in terms of what the properties, we've got a real problem with the old age of a whole load of owner-occupied stuff. It's not the only kind of people having bedrooms, the right number of bedrooms, is by no means the only strategic housing issue in London over the long term. The state of the housing stock is as big a question, I think.
Thank you.
Okay. Yes. And my next question is about calculating backlog need. So, what's the best way to calculate that, particularly for concealed households? I don't know which the best of you to answer this one.
I don't have a particularly strong view about the best way to calculate backlog need. What I can say is that I think this is the methodology that has developed over quite some considerable time. So I can remember perhaps 20 years ago being involved in local housing needs assessments, and over that time that process has been refined and developed. So you would hope through all of that discussion that what we're getting to in terms of approach is a reasonably effective one that takes account of all the metrics. So I kind of think that in terms of the best ways to do it, it's there. I think you can question the quality of the data, and I think there are some definite questions that should be asked around that. So, for example, the estimations of concealed household need are based on the use of English Housing Survey data. Is there a better source of data out there to do that? Possibly not without going out and capturing some new primary data, but there are some questions around how actually they derive those estimates. So, for example, the overall headline sample sizes sound terrific, but what about when we start to drill down and we ask the questions about, well, if we're assessing individual affordability, which is what they appear to be doing for concealed households, for their affordability assessments, what is the quality of that data looking like? So typically it is asked either by proxy or by individuals within the household, are they willing to give responses to income information, to savings information? This is something that's not particularly clear now. There may well be analysis of that, but I think those are the sorts of questions that you should be looking at in terms of reassuring yourselves about the quality of the data. So if, for example, you've got a high proportion not providing that information, then your sample size is smaller. How credible, how robust do those estimates, particularly when you're looking at a relatively small component of the population, become? So I think there are things like that would probably warrant some further investigation. In terms of the kind of the wider approach to the assessment of backlog need, as I say, I think there's been plenty of discussion about this, with the brain power applied to it much better than mine, I think, and we are where we are with that.
Okay. And I mean, So Census Data tells us there were 68,600 concealed families with children in London in 2011. Table 11 of the SHMAR on the concealed households says the need for 3-bedroom plus homes is given as 0. Do you know what the reason for that would be?
It does stand out as a particularly interesting something. It appears that they've just made an allowance for the concealed household size. Now, whether they're undercounting the actual household, the size of the concealed household, which would seem to suggest that it is. In other words, they're only picking up 1 or 2 person concealed households, and therefore making the assumption that that's all they require. That's what it appears to be. As you say, there's other evidence from LFS, for example, suggesting that there are actually larger concealed households. I guess that might come down to definitional issues. They've obviously been quite clear about how they've defined concealed households. It's a very prescriptive way of defining it. So there may well be some definitional issues there that might account for some of those differences. It does appear odd.
Yeah, you think with about 70,000 families with children, you'd expect there to be the need for family-sized housing for them.
I mean, I don't know whether this is an answer to your specific question, but Robin Smale in his paper has a sentence that makes what I think is this in some sense, the crucial assumption is that, or maybe is what holds this plan together, is that households facing a lack of supply of large enough properties in a neighbourhood signal to them as property prices, which are relatively high. So I don't know whether he's only talking about the market sector. Move out of the neighbourhood or out of London altogether. So there's this business that, if you like, the thing that makes the sums add up is the idea that if there are too many households needing larger properties, if they haven't got them, they'll just go. And that doesn't count as concealed demand. It's kind of like off they go. I don't know where off they go to. I don't know whether the folk are still supposed to work in London or what's supposed to happen. But there is this kind of... I'm always very interested in trying to find out in any of these modelling exercises, what is it, if you like, that makes the sums add up? There's almost certainly some assumption, almost like sort of, a sort of external assumption to make the books balance. And I think in this case, this thing that Robin Smale has picked up about what larger families for whom there isn't property, I think that's probably, I stand corrected, but I think that's maybe what's going on here. So if you make that assumption, it doesn't really matter how many concealed households, because you can just assume they're going to move out.
So that's what he calls the unfulfilled need.
Yes, well, it's unfulfilled, and it's not counted as need. You could.
Yes, it's unfulfilled. It's not.
It's unfulfilled and uncounted.
Uncounted need.
You've moved out wherever.
Can I just say, I slightly disagree with that, because the market's always worked as London and the southeast, wider southeast, and people do move out. You're right. Sometimes it's forced by the market, but sometimes it's just choice. People want to go and live in the seaside.
No, absolutely, and that has long been a feature. I think the question here would be, it looks like we're really accommodating all the people who need one beds, and is it just the larger families that are moving out? And I think over the longer period, you have to ask, I think I said this earlier, what's actually almost the population mix going to look like in London? Are we going to move to a position where somehow it's full of sort of singles of a variety of ages and far fewer kids? That presumably is buried away somewhere in the calculations that have been done by the planning team. So, I think that's one thing one should look at.
Can I just ask Stephen on the English Household Survey, we've been told when we had presentations on this that some of the questions are about aspiration, and if you on the basis that somebody who's sharing a 3-bed home, 4-bed home, might want a 1-bed, and I don't know how far the English Household Survey takes account of affordability, and I just wonder what impact that would have on the SHMAR.
Yes, I think there are some issues around how they've used some of the data collected from the HS to assess affordability, and I think one of those key issues is around the use of rental costs. So they do say in the Smale that they've used estimates of rental costs from the EHS as opposed to another recognised source such as the VOA, because it excludes housing benefit, local housing allowance rental. So they think that this is a better source of rental information. But again, I think you would want to ask just the kind of, these are people's responses to a question about rent. So how accurate are those? What is the proportion of missing information, don't know information? And how do those estimates triangulate with some of those other sources is a particularly important point. But also I think when you have a look at how they've calculated affordability, particularly thinking about the rental affordability calculation, it appears that they've used an average rent across the whole of London now. Again, this is from what appears in the document, and I think that would certainly be questionable if you think about some of the rental differences between inner and, you just say more broadly, inner and outer. So if, for example, you're applying a single rent cost, then they make an assumption about the proportion of income depending on their income levels, whether it's affordable or not, whether it takes up 20 or 30% of net income. So that's a fairly straightforward calculation. What's not clear is actually, are they applying that on the basis of a London-wide average rent level by bedroom size? Which
so you don't know whether there's relative pricing.
Exactly, and I think that it's not clear to me whether they've introduced some relative pricing or not. But the implication is obviously you might start to undercount the requirements in inner London and overstate the requirements in outer London. Now, they may well have assumed that balances out, and that's a perfectly reasonable assumption. But it wouldn't be a particularly difficult thing to introduce into that rental affordability count, assuming that they haven't done it. So, like, as you say,
that's a question we have to look for.
Definitely.
So just to follow up on that, again, with the sort of assumptions about sort of demand for one beds, I mean, if I asked most of my friends who are sharing, flat sharing, would you like to have a one bed flat of your own, they'd go, well, yes, absolutely, thanks very much, regardless of whether or not they can afford it, but also regardless of where they may end up in future. So, the likelihood is even if you've got a one bed flat, at some point, you're probably going to want a two or a three bed. Is that taken into consideration at all, or is it just the next step you're taking?
I don't think it is. I think the requirements are based purely on the bedroom requirements. So they do use aspirational data, but in quite a limited way, and it appears from what I've looked at that it's in the requirement for the intermediate housing market, where they ask about satisfaction with current accommodation and their likelihood to move in the next few years. So in fact, it's quite an interesting question. So here is going to, so the attitudinal questions are used in only a limited form, and it's only applying to the intermediate housing, so relatively small. But the questions that they're using around satisfaction, one of the things that we see from our research, and it's consistent across all of the research evidence, is that younger people are typically less likely to be satisfied, more likely to be dissatisfied. So there is a question, so if you introduce that into the model, actually are you skewing towards younger and by association probably smaller households? But the other interesting point, and particularly just in relation to the intermediate housing, is the question they ask around intended future moves. And the question that they ask from the English Housing Survey is, do you think you will eventually buy a home in the UK or not? So it's a fairly broad brush statement, eventually. So if that's the basis for their expectation, then you could feasibly see lots of saying yes, and particularly the young aspirations. Actually, I do at some point expect to be able to get onto the housing ladder. If they're captured within that assessment, then you've got, it's contributing to that requirement, and therefore you can expect, that to drive some of that smaller requirement. So I know it's a bit technical, but there are some details around this that would probably require some further clarification exactly how they.
Can I just ask on that? Is this a case, just to summarise, is this a case of rather than asking what people want, of assuming what they want, rather based on what the answers, rather than do you want a one bedroom, do you want a two bedroom, do you want a three bedroom?
Yeah,
they don't ask that.
It's not asking. It's not wanting. It's based on the bedroom standard that we've talked about, with the exception of a few small components that introduce this attitudinal component.
Thank you.
Right, Tom.
No, I'm done. I think it's Tony.
Okay. So, is it Tony?
Yeah.
I think my questions have already been answered, really, question 3, so why don't you move to 6 and just do that?
We have. Aren't you talking about migration?
We can ask the question if you want, but it's pretty obvious, isn't it? From everything else we've discussed, there's not an awful lot of data and we don't agree with all the models, but it's all assumptive, isn't it? Subjective rather. So if you want to answer the question, which is, should the SMAR consider the potential effect of Brexit on international migration? My view on that is it won't, and it should do all these things, but it's not going to, is it? Peter?
I think it comes back to this, what range are we...
Yeah.
What range are we talking about? And that would be one of the things that one would factor. I mean, hugely clearly it's so uncertain, but that isn't a reason for not having at least some look at it. And I do think this point about the last 10, 12 years, well, maybe 15 years now, I think has been, certainly in UK terms, different. So I think some different assumptions there. Testing sensitivity to that's worthwhile, even though you're still going to have something pretty fragile that comes out of it.
Coming up. Yes. All right, Tony.
Sure.
We talked about outmigration, families.
Yeah, we've done families.
And there are some questions around that, but I mean, there always has been a natural outflow, but it's how far we don't really understand exactly.
Well, it's how far and how fast, isn't it? I think Peter's best point is that, you know, unfortunately, bureaucracies, public and private, work on what's happened recently. You know, we all remember what's happened the last 5-10 years because we lived through it. And the reality is this has been a very unusual period. The older people in the room, we remember that, you know, frankly, the 70s and 80s are very different in terms of the level. So...
Completely different. No population growth in the 70s.
Yeah.
Well, then we were shipping people out of London.
Yeah.
Yes,
the jobs, it's very different.
I mean, I think one of the things you should be asking about...
5-bedroom house in Hackney for
Yeah.
females.
If only you'd been young enough.
If only.
Old enough.
Members, shall we move to...
Old enough, yeah.
There's your question, Andrew.
Yes. So can I just ask, you kind of touched on this, but it's quite difficult sometimes to ask, to understand how the SMAR has produced these figures that it has. And so, I mean, what are the risks of relying on the bedroom standard in the SMAR? How might that distort the need?
I think you've got two problems. One is that people who have a choice may very well not, I mean, on the basis of how people sort of reveal preference, what people choose to do, the danger of relying on the SMAR is that people just won't downsize to those one-bedroom places to anything like the degree that the SMAR assumes. And I really do think the question... I mean, I actually think it is fundamentally wrong to aim to downsize people to one, because I think the work that's done on this, we've done some work ourselves a few years ago with Age Concern, people do want a spare room. For perfectly understandable common sense reasons. An older single or an older couple will want a spare room for a whole host of reasons.
Would it fair to say that this aspiration would require a number of very unpopular evictions in order to...
Well, I don't know about that, but it would... I don't think there are any policy... There are no policy... All the policy levers at the moment are in favour of staying put. There's a huge cost associated with moving if you're going to buy, with around stamp duty, and let's not go into council tax, but council tax doesn't encourage you to downsize from larger properties because of the way it works. So there would need to be, they would be unpopular. We can agree on that they would, any kind of policy moves to make this happen would I think have to be unpopular. I think the other danger is that I do think in the, I mean, it's a bit on this point about, you get one bedroom flat now, but then you decide, you're going to have a kid, you're then, if people haven't got a choice and you've got all these one beds, what we're just going to see is we're going to be building in, I think, overcrowding from the first. And again, the 2 and even more the 3-bed places just give so much more flexibility if they can be affordable, which is a perfectly proper consideration, than 1-bed things. Are pretty inflexible. And of course, there's also, as we all know, the use of, big houses in the past can be have sharers living. There are lots of difficulties with that. But one-bed units are very inflexible things, I think, and that's a worry to build a long-term strategy on such an inflexible building block.
Are there alternatives that can be used to measure under-occupation and overcrowding?
I don't know if you're going to come to this question or not. There is, of course, a real problem in measuring this thing on the basis of rooms without taking any account of floor space. We are kind of in window tax territory. Am I no longer under occupied? And okay, you can't do it if you're in a social rented place, but owner occupiers can knock down walls. Is that going to say, okay, they're no longer under occupied? It's kind of crazy. So it's not I think we should be basing our long-term housing need on what we think people do need, and space must be part of that. Rooms cannot be the only measure.
Interesting. Thank you.
You sort of come on to the question I want to ask. So do you think that it would be, if you've got two people squashed into a box room, that's very different to, two teenagers squashed in a box room, very different to two teenagers, in a much larger room. Do you think we need to take into account the actual bed spaces rather than just the room?
Yes, I don't think teenagers should be sharing with one another. Then you don't have to go in their room, which is also desirable. But no, I think it's, this is really where this thing it can get at its worst. We know what older kids, what teenagers need, and we should rely on what we know. And if at all possible, they need a room on their own, if as possible, as far away from your bedroom as possible as well, really, but that's usually not possible. But they need that. And, I don't know where this idea that two teenagers of the same sex sharing is okay comes from, because it just doesn't,
It's quite an old sort of definition, isn't it, I think? Doesn't it go back to the 50s, the bedroom standard? Yeah.
I don't see why. Our standards of living in so many areas have risen out of all comparison, even certainly with what we have when we were children. I don't see why a bit more housing space and better quality housing, especially for teenagers, it shouldn't be deemed part of that. Why somehow this thing we should be it's just this mechanical process of putting people in bedroom boxes is so far away from what anybody should, I think, be talking about, which is about homes and how they work and how they need to be in order to work, so as family life stands a chance of getting from one day to the next.
So it might be a bit of a tangent. What's your view on the sort of, for years we've been increasing this, the standards have been increasing in terms of room sizes. Now we hear seductive noises from people like Pocket Housing and saying, no, actually you can be your space can be much smaller and you can have a good life like that. What do you think?
I think you should look at what people who have a choice do.
What an excellent reply.
I think it's almost leading to sort of a review of space standards and how they relate to different sort of family environment or family structures or individuals. At one end you got the sort of pocket size accommodation, and then at the other end, quite rightly, we've been talking about what those dwellings, which actually are homes, should be like. What are the right sort of spaces for that, which would determine the size, and therefore space standards do, because Park and Morris standards at one point in time were absolutely minimum. Now, they've pretty much become a luxury, And I think that is where, if you're talking about quality of life, we need to be looking at those things in a more focused, more intelligent way than what we're doing. Come away from this mechanical kind of calculations, number of bedrooms and so on and so forth. It's habitable space that we are talking about.
Navin,
Yeah.
I just want to say I think this will come up in the next session, which we've got to move on to in a moment,
Sure.
which is on
No.
density.
Yeah.
And I just wondered whether, Tom, you had any more to say.
No,
And
no.
if not, then we should go on
We
to,
go to Davins.
to Navin's question.
Chair, it's
Is Dan
related to...
Epstein in the room?
Yeah.
Do you want to, I mean, have you looked at this question, Dan?
We got, yeah.
You
We've
might
also
have
got
a
borough
view.
representatives, haven't we?
We've got to really speed up, folks, because there's a whole another session waiting for us. So if we could be as succinct as possible.
Then it's about housing size mix and challenges faced by boroughs in terms of policy H12 as it's been kind of put about. Can you tell us what is the rationale you reckon behind policy H12, which restricts the abilities of boroughs to set targets for housing size for market and intermediate housing?
Before I do that, I just think I have to say that I kind of agree with so much of what Peter and others have saying, but also space standards I think are really critical. And I think the other piece that hasn't been talked about, which Andrew sort of touched on around space standards, is flexibility actually. And I think we're just building smaller and smaller boxes which just restrict flexibility. And if you want different scenarios, which I think is absolutely important because we really don't know what's going to happen, and you restrict, you put very small space standards in, and you put people into one bedrooms, you just have no flexibility in future, which I think is really a problem. But I suppose the answer to your question directly is in some ways it's in the kind of the question. We're talking about market housing rather than social housing, and I guess that the kind of rationale. It's difficult for me to kind of to really know what the policymakers were thinking directly, but I guess the rationale is that the market will make better decisions, more responsive decisions to the market, to demand. They're not making decisions about the whole of the market, they're just making it about the market component of the demand. I think we rely heavily on, I guess they'll be more efficient at determining what's required and more responsive. We rely very heavily on the market to fund all the other things that we need when we deliver housing, the sort of social infrastructure, the green space, etc. And if you constrain them too much, you end up having no reserve to fund the rest of Section 106. I imagine is part of the component. I think it's the balance supply to kind of, so you've got some social which is controlled, and you've got some market which kind of gives you they consider a better kind of mix. And I think there's also a kind of, if we put too many constraints and consideration on the kind of markets, we'll just kill the kind of the market. I mean, effectively what's happened for a very long time is that we just haven't delivered the number of houses that we require. And if you continue to put more and more constraints on developers, perhaps they will continue not to put any, deliver the sort of the number of houses we require. So I think there are kind of sensitivities about how do we actually afford and deliver all the other things we require around housing, and to what extent can we kind of put pressures on the housing market to do
Dan,
that.
can I just ask, you said the market seems, the idea is that the market knows and can judge what's needed, but we do have a surplus of one-bed flats in some boroughs.
No, I'm saying this is, I think, the rationale behind it. I don't necessarily agree with it. I don't agree with it at all. I think actually we don't have a vision. I think, as Peter said, we don't really have this is a very technical exercise, and we've heard how it kind of works and how the assumptions were made, or doesn't work. It's not really vision-led. It's not really about the sort of place we want the city to be or what people really require. It's and the market responds to what they think they can sell. I'm sure actually we're going to go through a period now, because there's a real depression in demand for one bedroom and two bedrooms actually in the market, and for taller buildings, which is the last 5-10 years has been the kind of the opportunity. I think you're going to find a lot of developers will move out to zone 4 and 5 and 6 to deliver slightly bigger housing, because they recognise actually that's where the demand is.
They already are anyway.
Sorry?
They already are.
They already are. I mean, I know, but I think they'll probably kind of do more of that, and you'll find that they'll sit on schemes with where the densities are much higher, but they can't deliver them because we've killed off the international investment market, for better or for worse.
You see, I mean, the concern we have is the kind of unacceptable constraints that this policy puts on boroughs to have their own kind of prescriptive policies to meet their demand So I know that we have planners or reps from City of Westminster, Hounslow and Enfield. I'd quite like to hear from them on this particular matter. But I think the concern that we have had are from Brent, Greenwich, Hammersmith and Fulham, Harrow, Merton and Westminster. They all call for policy age 12 to be changed to allow boroughs to set their own targets for housing size for market and intermediate homes. I mean, this is something so fundamental, for each borough, whether it's inner or outer London boroughs, to sort of determine what is the right sort of housing mix for their own sort of needs and what they need to deliver.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are other boroughs, you say, that having a density matrix or whatever it is kind of imposed, and having numbers imposed is kind of helpful. I suppose it depends on the politics. If you're a borough that sort of faces a very hostile local community that doesn't want to build anything, actually having sort of numbers driven down perhaps is kind of useful. If you're a borough that sort of actually is trying to deliver more density, then perhaps it's kind of it's a sort of very good thing. I think the problem is you have a policy that sort of covers everybody. In principle, local authorities should be able to make their own decisions, and they also used to determine what the housing need was much more locally. They used to look at primary sources. We now look at secondary sources, and we look at very large sort of data sets. And I suppose the idea, we didn't deliver the number of houses that we required apparently. When this was delivered through local authority doing assessments. I suppose the argument was that maybe we'll do it more effectively if it's kind of if it's imposed from above. I think the truth is that you do need a strategic approach to housing, but you also need, it has to be sort of local context. So getting the relationship between those two things right is the important thing.
Dan, a lot of what you said is very relevant to the next session. I just want to cut to the chase and say, do you think boroughs should
be allowed to
set their own family housing targets?
Absolutely. They of course they must do.
Okay.
Can I just ask, but the OPDC has set their family housing target as half what their local estimate says they need.
Yeah. And Dan?
Yeah, I mean
knows the OPDC.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean that's right, and that's. But if you look at the densities and you look at the market and you look at the, whether families want to go and live in tall buildings and high density, all the evidence, just last week, evidence was produced which suggests no, families would rather kind of move out further to and live in larger properties that are closer to the ground, that have green space, that have schools, that have some, their own private garden, etc., than live in a kind of a taller building.
Is this where? So this is where there's a kind of difference between need and demand. Yeah. There might be a need in your area for that size of housing, but there's not demand because of the type of housing that you're building.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
that's
essentially.
Very good summary, Tom.
Yeah, kind
of that discussion. I have to listen. I'm really sorry, but we won't do justice to the next session. Yeah. I just want to. I'm going to ask our members to actually write into us with the shopping list of, just to refine. We've collected quite a lot of ideas for how you would improve the SHMA or what further work you think needs to be done. But could I just ask you for last comments, Steve and Peter, and then we'll stay on the platform, Dan, because we're moving into the density section. But could you are there any last comments you want to make? Quick ones.
I think I'm okay.
You're okay?
I'm done.
Done.
You've heard enough.
Okay. Well, thank you really very much. Do write in. We're going to continue this conversation because we've opened up quite a lot of questions.
You want us to write?
What?
You want us to write in with these questions?
Yeah, we want you. I mean, I would have asked you, because of time constraints,
sure.
I would have asked you to just say, to summarise what you think might be the improvements. And first of all, the improvements we need to the SHMA, and then areas where you think we need more investigation. Is that all right, Steve?
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you very much. Thank you both so much for what you've given us. And I have to
Chair, before we move on to the next
Yes.
section, can I ask the committee to note the report and discussion?
Yes.
And
Committee,
can-
we're going to note this report and discussion.
And can the committee also delegate authority to the chair in consultation with the deputy chair to agree to use the information from the discussion as part of the committee's participation in the forthcoming London Plan examination in public?
Happy with that? Yes. Okay, good.
And
Thank
I'll
you.
just take a minute
Thank
to swap
you.
them.
And now if our next panel would come up. Thank you, Reece.
Enjoy the next session.
Hey, where all these things get brought.
Lord. You're welcome, Stephen. Peter, to stay for the next session. Where are you from?
Yeah, well, we only had an hour.
You had head of strategic planning officer,
You're Kimball.
You've got to try and the trouble.
No, I know, but
You've just got to try to keep these meetings going on time.
David, hello.
Thank
you. Did you?
a lot of talk and long meetings and round in circles.
Thanks for that.
No, it's fine, but I thought Peter's points were absolutely right. You know, it's very technical, it's very mechanical, just everything to units. We don't really anything.
Oh,
It's really fascinating.
it was an interesting session, actually.
It was. I think someone should have asked about whether big data has a role actually in getting much better information on people. That's kind of what we
I think that was an interesting point, big data. It's a way of bringing it here and the density there. Are we?
It's pretty interesting that we don't use primary data anymore and encourage not to.
How's it going? Okay. Right. We're now going to look at, folks. Are we all right? Yeah. We're going to look at the management of density in the city, and particularly looking at focusing on whether the density matrix, which is now, it's proposed in the new London plan that should be scrapped, and whether it's appropriate that it should be scrapped, what's going to be in its place, and whether there's any alternative. At the moment, the Assembly's position is that it should be revised and refined. We've got a big panel. We've only got 4 questions, so we should be able to get through this in just over an hour, which is a hope. I'd like the panel to just introduce themselves, starting on my right with Duncan.
Duncan Bowie, currently a Research Associate at Bartlett School of Planning at UCL, having recently retired from running the planning course at the University of Westminster. I was Principal Strategic Planner in the London Plan team here between 2002 and 2007-8, and therefore responsible for both the policies in the original London Plan in terms of the housing content and also for the revisions we made to the density matrix in 2007-8. So the policies...
Oh, you can tell us what those revisions were.
I will explain the basis of density policy, since I don't think that's being widely understood by the GLA team at present.
Oh, Mark. Sorry, it was an introduction. You don't have to give us your CV. You just could
I'm Kimberly Hopkins. I'm City and Planning Policy Team Leader at Westminster City Council.
Thank you for coming.
I'm Jacob Tong. I'm a Senior Policy Officer at London Borough Council.
I'm David Lewis. I'm an architect. I was in private practice, now retired, but I hope I can bring something to the conversation.
Haven't you just published a book on design and density?
Yes, the reason why I'm here, I think, is because I've, with a colleague, just produced a second edition at the request of the publishers of a book called The Housing Design Handbook, Guide to Good Practice, which apparently has sold a great deal better than anybody expected. And so we've just last week completed 100,000 words, mostly written by other contributors. The thing about this book is that it's full of contributions from other members of the profession, rather than a single author.
Right, well, we'll look out for that. The other thing is, I think David's too modest to say this, but he actually, the whole social housing, he set up Circle 33, Levitt Bernstein, and you know, he is an absolutely sort of fundamental player in the social housing movement. Onwards.
I'd like to be able to follow that, David, but I'm not sure I can. My name is Riëtte and I'm Strategic Planning Lead at Enfield Council.
And I'm Dan Epstein. I work both as I'm writing the environmental planning policy at OPDC, and I'm also private. I work as a consultant, advising developments around the country and around the world on how you do sustainable development at scale.
Excellent. Okay, well, I'll open. As I said, we've got 4 quite straightforward questions. Mine is, starting with the current density matrix, and what do you think's been the impact of it? If I start with a borough, start with Enfield and Nearing, what's been the impact of it, and do you think there have been any unintended consequences?
Well, I think generally, over the last...
I just want to say, in this room, it's quite echo. You have to just project a lot into the mic.
Yeah, I think generally the matrix has been... It's taken its time in the borough, but over the last 10 years, it's generally started to become more understood, particularly where we have a borough that is, an outer London borough, and some of the development, in fact, quite a lot of the development we've been seeing has been around more of our suburban areas as well. So having that understanding, Enfield is quite lucky; it has 22 stations, but that doesn't necessarily mean the PTEL levels are particularly high. We have seen a lot of development, particularly in the last 5 years, where I think the impact of the matrix has been quite useful in being able to take the community with us in terms of optimising those sites for regeneration within some of our more prominent parts of the borough, where there are relatively decent accessibility levels, not particularly high, but there are decent accessibility levels. So I think in giving understanding to how development comes forward, which is very different to the existing typologies, it's helped communities in sort of framing their understanding of why these new typologies are emerging, why these new densities are emerging. So it has been quite a useful tool to help explain that.
And unintended consequences?
Whether they're unintended or not, I think the matrix from the market perspective it's a constant push on local authority planners to perhaps look beyond what were densities acceptable previously. So I think the unintended consequences have actually been to have more of an open approach to how you can fulfill better use of sites, but also then push for better design as well in a local context. So I wouldn't necessarily say that there have been that many negative consequences. I think we've achieved good development and designed in an appropriate way. But the matrix is there and developers will respond to that by constantly pushing for higher and higher densities. And I think it's within the skill set of the local planners to be able to advise the committee, you know, what is acceptable and find the balance within the matrix ranges, really.
Interesting, okay. So Enfield's position then, in your response to the London Plan, is that you would like to see the density matrix retained?
Retained, possibly refined, to deal with more...
Well, we're going to get on to that. So
okay.
If we just... That seems to be okay. Can I then come to Kimberley, Westminster?
Yeah, so I'll echo the comments from Enfield really, that it's the density matrix has been quite a useful tool for the planners to...
Again, can I just ask you to just,
yeah,
for the webcast, speak closely to the mic?
Yeah, so it's been quite a useful tool to use as a benchmark for general appropriate densities in Westminster. It's not seen as something that has to be strictly adhered to, but it at least gives a benchmark and a starting point for discussions with developers. In terms of unintended consequences, again, not that many in terms of negative impacts of the using the density matrix, but one thing which we have seen occasionally is that because it's quite a technical tool and perhaps quite difficult to understand if you're not a planning professional, that residents might misunderstand exactly what the matrix is about, and so I think we would support a more refined matrix that explains a bit more what's appropriate rather than just the figures that are in the table.
Okay. All right. Not anymore on the unintended consequences.
No.
No. Okay. And then if we could hear, and so Westminster's position in its response to London Plan.
Retain the matrix.
Okay. Now can we hear from Hansel?
Yeah. We responded to say that we didn't think it needed to be kept, just for clarity. That was the council's position. I think I'm going to try and take this from, try and be quick with two angles, because I'm a policy planner principally, so my interaction with this is in terms of writing housing policies, working out capacities for sites and site allocations, that sort of thing, the strategic level, rather than how it works when a developer comes to you with a development. And the two responses I think are extremely different. So speaking to my GM colleagues, basically the London Plan density matrix, developer takes the top level density for the area, and then that's their initial starting point for discussions, usually a few higher than that. The interesting thing is that then begins the discussion, and I think it's important to note here that I think that point is the point that's also being taken backwards in terms of understanding how much a developer should pay for the land. So the density matrix itself is having an important impact on the dynamics of the land market, which itself impacts on the dynamics of affordable housing delivery, because the higher they pay for the land, the more constrained they are in terms of their ability to deliver affordable housing. So taking it back to the kind of strategic approach, I've found that basically I'm currently in the process of doing capacity assessment. The density matrix continues to be the key document that starts your discussions about where you start with in terms of density for those sites. So because it's adopted as an established approach, you take that as your beginning point and then you work from there. But I think that there are significant issues with taking that approach, especially in areas such as Hounslow, where we are looking at trying to get significant infrastructure investment to develop and get better PTALs. So if you look at the current densities within those areas, you're not getting what you could get once you get the infrastructure, and you're kind of constrained by it. So our position is that the density matrix has a huge impact in terms of the development management side of it, not so much possibly in terms of actually getting front-loaded development at the strategic planning stage, which is why we kind of said, well, we'd like to go for a density by design approach. And that's pretty much what I've got to say. In terms of its unintended consequences, I think I started with them, which is that the developers essentially start at the top and then work backwards from there. It's not really being used in the way it was originally intended. I mean, if you've read Jennifer Peters' notes on it, the intention at the beginning was that it would be something that was thought about, but it was essentially a design-led approach. And what's actually happened is that we've ended up really rigorously sticking to what the numbers are in this. And I think the final point I make about that is it's important to note that the planning system has an extremely strong set of pitfalls if you mess up on housing delivery, and it doesn't have anywhere near as strong as safeguards on design. So it's natural that councils will move towards adopting approaches that focus on delivery of numbers and the numbers, and always the numbers, rather than focusing on getting good design outcomes. But that's more of a general comment on density in the planning system, rather than the matrix. And I think the matrix attempts to find a balance point between that by saying, okay, we're not going to completely throw the doors open to whatever you want to develop, but we also accept that there does need to be a delivery of higher densities in areas.
So you definitely, and we all do, I think, welcome the emphasis on design. But I think what we're trying to tease out is, you know, what that means for boroughs and how far. I don't want to answer it now, but it should come out over the hour. And how much, really, how much the density matrix needs to be sort of changed, and whether you could, you know, have both the design and the density matrix maybe. But anyway, let's see how that goes.
Could I just very quickly on that? It seems like you're saying that much as the borough's position is that they don't object to the density matrix being removed, that there seems to be an internal debate within Hounslow about how what the effects that might have.
I think as planners it's very difficult often to think of things in terms of having to make a call or based on your professional judgment rather than being able to go, oh well, XPI policy says this, so that's what we're going to do. And I think that's where the primary difficulty is. But also I think for DM planners, the challenge is that once you begin to remove, as we saw with the MPPF, structures that have been put in place to control and kind of change the shape of development, it places a hell of a lot more pressure on them to come to very carefully worded decisions about stuff on the threat that they're going to get taken to appeal, and then people are going, but where did you get this density figure from, right? As long as the Duncan plan is there, they can still say, well, the Duncan plan says this, we've gone a bit above that, so there's an evidence base to support the view that was taken on this site. Do you know what I mean?
So
Does that answer your question, Andrew?
So the negative thing is the density, the fact that it might actually make it very difficult to defend at appeals. It's about evidence, but you've said that you think you can provide an alternative evidence base.
I think it goes into some of those questions as well about reasons.
Yeah, we'll come back to that. Dan, same question.
Let me sort of echo what others say. I think it's used as a fix. I think we kind of tend to take it too literally. I think it's used as a starting point. So, you know, the evidence suggests that, I don't know, over 50% of developments have gone well beyond the density. The kind of, I suppose, the impact, I think we tend to underplay, because of density, the importance of local character, context, provision of social infrastructure and various other facilities which are really essential if you're going to push up density. And I think often they don't get funded because we're in constrained times, so you end up with, you know, a sort of housing rather kind of mixed-use development and good place if it's not done properly. I think you also often end up with taller development. I think you consequently end up with smaller spaces as well, because you get potentially kind of, I thought that land point was really interesting, higher land values. And I think we should actually be kind of doing more work around what the appropriate density is. We should sort of see it as a kind of guide, but actually not replace it. And I think what we then don't do is do a proper capacity study based on a much broader kind of set of parameters. You know, what does this place require? And then go back and kind of have room to push the densities up or down depending on, you know, the kind of the local context, which I think kind of gets missed. I think we end up just, as I said, starting at that density, not doing the other studies as thoroughly as we could. We're driven by capacity, and we end up creating sort of slightly lopsided places potentially with smaller, more one-bedroom property.
Thanks, that's good. Okay, thank you. And David?
You're dealing with your 4 questions in order, or just...
We're dealing with them in order.
In order.
We're trying to deal with them in order.
Well, since
we're just really, just, you know, what do you think has been the impact?
Since you contacted me, yes.
I mean, David, at this stage, just if you've got things to add to what's already been said.
Well, I have, I think.
Good.
Our view is that it's been a pretty crude tool, and we think on a London-wide basis there seems fairly broad agreement that PTAL is not the best method of appraising density. But it was an understandable method when it was first implemented. One of the unintended consequences has been the quick response of certain developers to acquire sites in more outlying regions. Romford, for example, in the knowledge that Crossrail will improve Petal considerably, and they then apply for planning for extremely tall, dense residential buildings in order to make a quick killing on land values when they sell the site. We have seen lots of this, often in locations where the proposal face low-rise, local-centred terraces, where, irrespective of improving Petal, the tall buildings entirely inappropriate. Often it feels as though the other planning safeguards to ensure quality really aren't robust enough to stop this kind of cynical development.
So you're critical, therefore, of the fact that that wherever there is a station, it's 800 metres, isn't it? 800. Is it within 800 metres? Within 800 metres of any station, one is able to. Well, it's about higher density, but it could be about high rise, I guess. Is that what you're criticising?
Yeah.
That's in the new London plan. That's new. But you're already critical of Petals. The relationship between public transport and density.
Yes, I mean on the whole, we favour scrapping Petal.
Scrapping
Petal? Scrapping the matrix.
Okay. In favour of scrapping the matrix?
Yeah.
Okay, we'll come on to what you're going to put in its place.
In an extremely qualified way, with a lot of suggestions about what you do in order to safeguard what was previously, in our view, not very successfully safeguarded by the matrix.
Okay. And now to Duncan. Duncan, if you could just add to what's been said. Great.
Yeah, I will do. I think it's worth reminding colleagues of the basic purpose of the density policy, which was to relate the density of new development to a range of factors, public transport, neighbourhood character, and the distance and relationship with local centres at district levels up to metropolitan centres. In the revisions that we did in 2008, following a research report by Joris and Patel Taylor, architects, what we did was we actually took out the factor of the built form as a driving factor for density. In the original matrix, if you built basically flattered accommodation, you could double the density. So the built form was the driver rather than housing need. We also removed the car parking space as a contributing factor because that's under separate policy. But what we also did was shift the matrix ranges from units per hectare to habitable rooms per hectare, because density was primarily about how many people you could house rather than the number of units. And we found that in the early years of the London plan, the density policy was actually driving smaller units, especially, I mean, the original matrix, as you've got in your notes, actually didn't allow you to provide family accommodation in central London, and basically argued that you should only provide family units in outer London, so not relating to housing need at all. So the policy was actually amended, so including a policy revision that went into the plan following the public inquiry at the time. The form of housing output should be determined primarily by an assessment of housing requirements and not by any assumption as the built form of development, which is basically saying planning is about planning to meet a range of housing needs that you assess through the SHMA and through other assessment, having regard to the local context, rather than just being driven by what a developer can come up with and basically make the most money. What the original density policy, the density policy as revised, also took into account that you needed a range of homes in terms of size, the bedroom space standards were subsequently introduced, and a range of built form. If you move too far away from the density range, you actually end up with an inappropriate range of housing outputs. And all the data published since the London plan, partly through the annual monitoring report, through other analysis, has actually demonstrated that the more you move away from the ranges in the London plan, the more you move upwards, as other people have been commenting, the less you get in terms of family size housing, the smaller the units become, and actually the more the units are moving up market in terms of affordability. the density, the unintended consequences, I mean, as others have commented, I mean, we can hardly say the density policies have been applied rigidly when all the data shows that more than 50% in every year since 2004 of schemes have been approved above the density levels, in some cases by factors of 5 or almost 10 relative to the top of the range at 435 dwellings per hectare, 1,100 habitable rooms per hectare if they're primarily small units. As others have said, in terms of negotiations, developers and often planners have actually used the top of the range as a minimum rather than actually look at the ranges which are actually quite wide, and you can get a lot of variation in terms of types of housing within the ranges. The argument for abandoning the matrix seems to be, well, because development hasn't complied with the matrix, let's get rid of it. But as we'll come on to in a moment, there are real issues about what you would substitute for this guidance. My own view remains that if you want the housing you need in London, you apply the matrix as it is. There is a case for amendments which we'll come on to, but the other issue that's happened is the non-application of the density policy has actually had a dramatic impact on price of land and on house prices. And if you waive the density policy and you waive or reduce the affordable housing requirements or don't apply them strictly, you're basically leading to land cost inflation and house price inflation. So it's actually the non-application of the density policy rather than the policy, which was roughly right. It's the non-application which is partly responsible for house price inflation, land price inflation and inappropriate housing output and the kind of hyper-density developments which are so far beyond policy as to be nothing to do with planning or housing need whatsoever.
Right, okay. I think that's a very good introduction to the whole topic from all of you. Thank you. So we'll move on to question 2.
Well, question 2, I think you've answered the first bit, which is, do you think the Mayor is right to propose scrapping the density matrix? So can I ask you the second part, each of you, maybe starting with Duncan, do you think his proposals enables boroughs to optimise development in terms of density, please?
Sorry, the proposals in the revised plan basically will allow developers and local authorities complete flexibility to negotiate whatever was felt to be appropriate. The difficulty is that's the end of strategic planning at a London-wide level in terms of appropriate use of sites, but it also presupposes that local authorities have the capacity to do the kind of level of design scrutiny which David's new design guide, I'm sure, sets out in great detail, but my view remains that that design has to actually operate within a policy framework, and the policy framework should be based on what is actually needed in London. So, I mean,
do you think, though, bearing in mind, I agree with you, but if you presuppose that we are pushing it down to the boroughs, which is basically what he's doing, do you think that could even work? My view is no, but I mean, do you think they have the resources?
I mean, some boroughs have more capacity than others. Sure. The difficulty is, unless clearer policies are actually, once you abandon a policy in the London plan, you're then left with individual boroughs trying to invent policies through the local planning system, which then, if they're prescriptive, or even reintroducing a density policy at a local level, a developer can go to appeal and say that's in breach of the London plan. So you're really not, by passing flexibility down the line and removing the overall policy framework, you're, in my view, weakening boroughs' ability to negotiate. The difficulty you've also got is that other drivers come into play. Maximising units rather than optimising units, meeting your housing targets as set out in the London plan, getting your new homes grant through, not getting penalties from delivery. All those criteria from central government and elsewhere and from the London plan are unit numbers. They're not actually about quality or quantity. And really, quantity, in terms of quantity, I mean the types of houses, what kind of space standards and so forth you're using. And a lot of boroughs, we're not really implementing the space standards in the London plan very comprehensively either. So there are real issues about the impact on quality. But the whole purpose of a London plan is a sense to set a framework which actually is using London's resources as a whole to meet London's needs. That's the whole purpose of strategic planning. There is a real problem if you try and get design negotiations without any policy framework without basically any planning policy context. Design has to work within a planning policy context. Removing the planning policy context leaves everything to subjective discussions at a local level, depending on which planner's in the room, which architect's in the room, who's the most effective lobbyist. And, you know, the issue about money counts becomes the dominant factor. Money and units count. Quality is really problematic if left to a subjective level. And similarly, all these issues about land cost inflation and house price inflation basically get reinforced, and we're in an even worse situation than we are at the moment.
I agree anyway. Kimberly?
Yeah, I think Duncan's touched on one of the big issues that Westminster have got is that we really, really want to retain some form of density matrix. Yes. So if it's gone from the London plan, then we're intending to put something similar in our local plan to still try and give us that tool to optimise development. I think the issue with taking the matrix away from that strategic level is, yes, it may lead to optimisation of development, but actually I think what it's going to lead to is maximisation of development, which is not the most sustainable way that we can deliver housing in Westminster. As you know, the dense nature of Westminster means that sites are quite scarce, so when a developer does get a site, they want to put as much on it as possible, and the density matrix gives us that tool to make sure that the sites that come forward to the development that results is of the optimal amount of housing for that site within the context of Westminster. I'll just reiterate that we think that scrapping the matrix leaves us in a vacuum in a policy context.
I agree. Jacob, have you got anything else to add to what you've already said on that?
I think it's very interesting to compare actually the two views here, because obviously coming from Hounslow, which is out of London, there are areas of extremely low density, there are areas of some high density. In fact, Hounslow is interesting because it goes all the way from Chiswick all the way out to Heathrow, so it's basically an entire subsection of the London market. It goes from super prime £1 million houses all the way out to conservation areas out to basically Heathrow. So I think the interesting thing is in terms of, let me cut this down so I'm being too wordy. This was my point. So we don't think the density matrix is needed because we can't see how it's relevant to some of the areas of outer London as it is to the inlet areas, right? In Westminster, I can recognise that the scale of the land prices, the pace of things is so high that you need that central pillar you can stand upon. But in outer London, I think it's less important. And the thing is that if we get tied to the density matrix, let me go into what David was saying about this land value grabbing thing, right? Because developers know it's there, they know there's a framework they can rely on, they can go back to appeal on it. They can then go out to a bit of Hounslow and go, right, this is going to increase in P-Towns, grab it now, get a big development on it because the London plan says you can have up to this much at this P-Town, then sell it on, right? It actually encourages that kind of behaviour, whereas if we didn't have the density matrix, they'd have to be a lot more careful about how they approached those sites. Or we'd have a lot more power, arguably, in our hands to say, no, on this site, actually, we think design-wise it could get this. I think the important thing to note on this point as well is that Hounslow is currently developing a tool to do density by design on the basis that the London plan approach is going to go forwards. So we're trying to work out how we can get some kind of rapid assessment.
Are you doing that yourself or with an external organisation?
We're doing it with an external organisation. But we're currently already looking at that. And we've already kind of imbued that approach because we have 2 opportunity areas in the borough, and they're the main areas we're focusing on for growth. And within those areas, we're already doing master planning exercises to get those densities. Yeah. So in a way, we're already responding to a context in which there isn't the density matrix ceases to continue to apply. However, I still think that you're going to see the density matrix, whatever happens, as a hallmark of almost all development for a good couple of years, because people will continue to rely upon it as a tool, even if it's not formally within the framework, because it's the adopted approach. I think the Assembly can take some comfort from that in some respects that will be there. But I do think that arguably the best approach forward is to allow boroughs to apply their own density matrix if they wish, but then also allow flexibility for boroughs to take other approaches if they wish as well.
Jacob, sorry, can I just come in? You mentioned, that in a density matrix, and then you agreed with David over the link with P-Towns. But in fact, there's no density matrix in the London plan, and it has the most strong P-Towns policies, much stronger than they've ever been before, and everywhere, more or less, wherever there's a station. So, isn't that at odds with what you just said?
That's a good point. I suppose. The hope is that we can, by looking at design-led and really focusing in on these sites, we can kind of anticipate what developers are going to do on those sites already. But I agree that, the PTAL policy does present a problem with gearing those sites towards high-density development. On that
and
point,
also to land speculation.
Yeah. Although I guess the argument would go that if I'm your average hedge fund coming in from above onto London and I'm looking at how I can make money, if there are strong central planning policies that basically begin to develop a framework for how I can value that land, then I have a much easier time of just going in there and deploying my kind of resources on buying and selling sites than if have to do much more research into what the local level is doing. I mean, it's not a point that I would formally agree with, but it's a point that's worth raising, is that these kind of policies at the strategic level do allow for the London land market to be more easily interacted with by international capital flows, which in my opinion are the primary reason why we've had such fast land inflation. And are the real drivers of sites like David was saying, where you get this build them small, stack them high sort of things. You know? And I think that's an important point to raise, the impact of the London plan in deploying policies that allow those larger companies to operate with land as an exchange commodity rather than for building actual beneficial parts of the economy.
It's a very fine balance, our view. When I said that scrapping the matrix is probably the right move, I would quickly have said, but only if it's replaced by very robust safeguards on quality, which don't seem to be currently strong enough in the draft London plan. We're personally believers in high density standards, environmental amenity, maybe even space for higher density development. And if you turn up the dial on density, then you have to turn up the dial on quality as well. The draft London plan seems aggressively pro-development to us without suitable safeguards.
Thank you. Nero?
From Enfield's perspective, I think it's worth saying that proactive borough and very much in favour of good growth with the challenging housing targets that we have. And I think not having the matrix will to some extent hinder us as a local authority to be able to optimise the land resources that we have to provide, both, the quality and the types of housing. And I think Duncan's point about having that strategic policy framework is a welcome one, but we as local authorities have to take our own responsibility in how we then interpret the matrix when it comes to us through a scheme and what is appropriate. And what Jacob was saying about DM officers often feeling, in every committee report it's analysed in terms of what the density is of the scheme compared to the London plan. And I think that's a responsibility we have to take on as local planning officers, is to find the right and appropriate level of development based against something, and that something has been in place and has been become widely understood, not just from the development industry but also from boroughs that need to take their share of growth as well. And I think not having it will lead to the same issues, if not worse than the issues of boroughs potentially backing out of their responsibility to deliver London's housing need, actually. Because you'll get some who are proactive and setting design-led density targets and being upfront, and others who will just simply not do that at all.
Did you say something? No? I thought Nicky was saying you weren't coming. Sorry, Dan.
I think we flip-flop. If you go back over time, we go from borough to strategic, etc. I think it's kind of, and actually there isn't a sort of dialectic. Actually, I think there is a lack of application of policy, which is sort of driven land price, which I think Duncan's actually right. I think the other point that Duncan made, which I thought was really important, is that we're just derogating on sort of strategic planning and we're pushing this all down. In reality, it's not about housing numbers. It seems that the whole thing seems to be about housing numbers. It's actually about creating a proper city that works, and for housing has to be associated with planning around infrastructure, green space, all the rest of it. And that a lot of that has to be done at a London and also a beyond London sort of scale. And we seem to be kind of just losing sight of that. In reality, I think you need a really strong set of strategic policies that need to be properly applied. You need strong borough policies, and borough approaches to housing, which need to take their direction from the strategic, but be allowed to kind of be much more context specific. They then need to kind of relate to neighbourhood plans, which need to be, again, even more specific and consider the kind of the broad things that a neighbourhood requires and what the capacity of that neighbourhood is for housing, the type of housing and the mix of housing, etc. And it kind of varies. Tower Hamlets is very different from houses, very different. So, and then ultimately it needs to come back down to the sort of the site, which needs to kind of take its context from all of that and respond to that. And and what we end up doing is I think we put far too much kind of emphasis now on the site and on the developer and on kind of fairly weak policies, and then not doing proper master plans, not doing proper development frameworks, etc. And actually allowing the whole thing, partly because of viability and because of that's where all the funding comes from. We just don't put funding in any other ways. If you go around Europe, actually planning authorities have funding, they lead development, they determine what's going to happen, they provide often service plots, and the builders build, and they build to sort of standards and they understand the price, and the risk is sort of to some extent sort of taken out of this, and it's a much kind of more straightforward approach.
I agree with all that, but can I just take you back to the question? I know it's hard to give a black and white answer, but do you think Mr. Carnes has enabled the boroughs to optimise development in terms of density?
I think in principle yes, in practice no.
Scrapping.
So I think if the world was if every local authority could actually kind of have the resources etc to do this kind of really well, then yes, I think it's a bit like David was saying. It's kind of but I think in the real world you need density, and I think you need stronger strategic planning, and I think you need stronger direction.
Great, thank you. I've finished. Question 2's over. Next.
Sorry.
Well, it comes. These is neatly onto my question, which is precisely about resources, and whether or not you think that not just policy D6, which places all these extra requirements, but various other policies in the London Plan which put a lot more burden on local authorities. Do local authorities have the resources to deal with it, and are the requirements realistic? I mean, Dan, I think your answer before suggested you don't think they do.
I mean, local authorities have been undermined for a long, long time. They have fewer and fewer resources. They have less ability. NPPF, drives us to use sort of secondary, not primary sources of data, etc. I mean, I think everything kind of suggests that. But I think somebody else sort of said it's very mixed. I think some local authorities sort of excel, and other ones, don't have the resources. So I think it's very sort of again generalising kind of difficult, but actually the pattern has been they've been undermined. They have fewer resources, they have fewer planners, they have fewer strategic plans, they have fewer DC people, they have less expertise, and yet we want to build a higher density. And as sort of David said, density has to come with quality, and therefore you need to strengthen all of those things. So pass it all down, but pass it with resources. Don't pass it down and kind of just expect people who are sort of drowning to start swimming faster.
Nero?
Yeah, I would agree with what Dan said, absolutely. Whilst we don't want the mayor to dictate the way boroughs plan, and so there's a level of what strategic policy is required, and then what is left to the boroughs to determine. And I think there's got to be a flexibility where boroughs are taking more proactive approaches with design panels, with capacity modelling. They should be allowed to set their own targets should they want to in terms of capacity. But just fundamentally, I think the skills as well as the resources are just not there on a borough level to actually necessarily replace. And what you then end up having is local markets, local London markets being played off, boroughs being played off against each other with the development community as well. And that's and particularly where growth is going outward, and you don't have the policies there, then the borough could be left open to sort of weak and poor development coming forward, and more pressures on from the development community.
It would be nice to be able to do, but in the absence of the resources, you need something to fall back on in the London plan.
Well, it's absolutely, and it could be there, but with it not being there, you've got nothing to fall back on if you can't fulfil that obligation at borough level.
Davis?
Well, when I've said already that we think on the whole scrapping the policy is the right move, that's heavily qualified by the fact that our impression across London is that the resources and skills within local authorities are simply not there, and that it would be reckless to abandon the policy until those resources are available and ways are found, and there have been some ingenious suggestions about finding resources to help local authorities.
Thank you, Jacob.
I think fundamentally there are just basically two ways. For starters, I think policy D6 basically seems to anticipate, as far as I can from reading it, that sites will come forwards as part of a planned approach. So it expects this policy to be applied primarily to something like a site allocation, essentially, or through an opportunity area framework or something. It's anticipating that you've already done a lot of work in the council to understand the site context. So when a developer comes to you with an offer, you can recognise it and have a discussion, rather than it just coming out of nowhere and being a windfall. So I think that's one issue of the policy. But I think principally, basically, you've got two choices. You can either fund specialist staff who can respond to development applications as they come in, or you can fund evidence bases that allow your regular, generic, no offence to JM planners, planning officer to read that evidence, understand the context, and then apply that. They're your two options, right? You either front load it in large evidence bases, or you do it site by site by site. What's interesting is that policy H2, the small sites policy, anticipates that you'll take the evidence-based led approach because it requires you to, I can't remember the exact frame, but it requires you to do these kind of miniature character studies which look at areas and then understand how
That's
you
the
might...
design codes.
For the small sites. So it's basically anticipating that you're going to do that evidence base in that case.
Yeah.
So I thought that was interesting because it's basically saying, okay, that's how you're going to do it there. But I think that's principally what I'd say about that, is that there is a definite reason.
Is that specifically related to small sites, though, that one, or is it broader? I can't remember.
The area design code is related to small sites.
But
in fact, what is related to this, and it's in other policies, is evaluation of growth capacity, the character assessments, your tall building strategy, your open space strategies, and particularly the first two, the evaluation of growth and the character assessments. So those do apply, presumably, to this. Wouldn't you think so, Jacob?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think the thing that I'm getting from the London Plan generally is that it has a different approach for small sites and large sites, right? Density with the large sites seems to be being taken.
All the other things you'd have to do to make the site approach work in the eyes of, if you're Finn Williams or if you're me. And I just wonder what you say about that, because I worry, the idea of people bringing consultants just to work on this site.
I mean, all I was trying to characterise was that there are two ways of dealing with this, which is that you either get a resource in that can deal with applications as they come in,
proactive and a reactive approach.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And then the London Plan says, in one respect, with the smaller sites, you should be taking the proactive approach. Is that the one?
Yes. Yeah. To come up with the design codes, and then people come and they say, "Okay, that's what the borough expects," and it's meant to fit in with that.
Yeah. And then presumably with the other stuff, as you're saying, it's reactive. So I do think there is, but as I said at the beginning, I think policy D6 anticipates almost that you're going to have taken a proactive approach to sites that are coming in on that level. I think this is especially hinted at by the fact that there's these basically they're going to keep some of the density things in terms of the maximum numbers, right? And those are the ones that will be referable to the mayor. That's almost anticipating that these really super mega sites will almost always go to the mayor for decision rather than being given to local boroughs. QED, they don't need to prepare an evidence base to fight those really, really hard cases. That's how I read it.
But there's a stipulation that if they're going to go to the borough, you've got to do an area management plan.
Yeah. So
is that what you're saying? If they go to the mayor, if they are above the top of the current density rate, then they have to have an area management plan and an extra layer of design scrutiny, quote.
Yeah, so but I mean, if you think about that in terms of resources for the boroughs, that's anticipating that those really big applications will almost always be referred to the mayor in some respect.
But doesn't it expect that you will have done the work already?
It does, yeah. But I mean, all I'm trying to say is, in terms of if I'm a borough, if I've got a really massive application that comes in, really scary one, they've got a lot of money, they can really go at this if they want to, then there is this. I guess the point's kind of got lost in like what I was trying to say about trying to understand resources essentially. I guess I'm trying to get too detailed into what the resources mean, but yeah, I think but it's just in terms of understanding it in terms of strategic planning, right? Like if you've got really some of what David was saying about this stuff about developers trying to get land values and stuff, right? In some respects, the plan attempts to I'm just going to stop. Is that all right? Because I'm getting too far into the details.
Don't worry.
Come back to it.
Yeah.
You can come back to it if you want. Yeah,
that's right.
I'll come to Kimberly now.
Yeah, so I wanted to make a point in relation to the design codes that are required under policy H2 or H11? H2. With regards to resourcing, because most of Westminster's housing delivery comes from small sites, over 90% small sites. And if there's a requirement to produce design codes, design guides for small character areas across Westminster, then that's a huge resourcing issue for us. Not least because we have a lot of delivery from small sites, but also because the character across Westminster is so different at such a fine grain that would introduce a huge resourcing issue for us. I think the approach in D6 works better for larger sites where you're looking at everything at the start. So there's requirements under Part B to consider current and future planned infrastructure, and that's quite difficult to do at a smaller grain level. Whereas if you're planning a town extension or a very large site somewhere in perhaps an opportunity area, it's much easier to apply this approach to. But I don't think it works across the board.
Okay. And do you have, I mean, in terms of your sort of capacity, you talked about the small sites being very resource intensive. What about the larger sites? Do you have the capacity to essentially master plan these?
Really?
No. And Duncan, I think you've basically sort of said already you don't think that boroughs are resource enough to deal with it.
I want to make one additional point. I mean, in a sense, David Levitt, I think, was right to say you don't abandon a framework. It's reckless to abandon a framework unless you've got a work system that actually works as a substitute in all 33 local planning authorities and the 2 development corporations. I mean, I think I need to stress that the proactive requirement at local authority level is not just about design. It's not just about having a design panel, if you can actually get anybody on a design panel to agree anything, but that's another matter. It's actually about what is needed in terms of the development in the borough, in the specific location, which is not just a design issue. It's what kind of housing you can actually get on a site. Does that meet your range of needs? So it has to be planning-led. And I think there are real problems with the majority of boroughs in London not actually having the capacity to do the briefs for sites. You can allocate a site, but actually writing a brief for a site which actually says, this is what is needed in the borough. We can achieve so much on this site, but maybe we can't achieve as many family homes. Maybe we can't get as much social rent as we want. But setting out a brief that the developer actually works to. A situation where a developer comes in with a proposal and then you try and set up a design-based negotiation, at which point you've got nothing on density policy, you're trying to struggle back on what needs you're trying to meet, you're working in a purely reactive manner. So that's my point I was making earlier, that at a local site level, design discussions have to work within the framework of what is needed on the site from a borough point of view based on their SMA and their assessments of employment capacity and the rest of it. And that must drive the debate. What I'm really worried about is just a situation where a developer comes up with a proposal which breaches all the policies in the London plan, which 99% of them do, and you're then basically trying to negotiate about design, about distances between, rooms, about open space, and about the height and so forth. And my concern is not with the kind of marginal intensification, as I'll come back to. I'm proposed put in a submission saying we can increase some of the density ranges in suburban areas where there's good public transport and so forth. But a situation which basically kind of just is open door for sort of these kind of very subjective negotiations between whoever the developer brings in and whoever the council manages to find, and even possibly putting in a designer into the discussion without a planner in the room. And design is not a substitute for planning.
Thank you.
So you're actually saying you're making a juxtaposition between need and this evaluation of growth, which...
Well, it's the kind of growth. I mean, the plan, I have to say, goes on about good growth, but doesn't actually necessarily specify the mechanisms to ensure that housing development, or even in fact employment creation, actually meets a set of requirements for certain groups who are actually in need of that provision. You can have a separate debate about the kind of social policy elements of the plan, which are much weaker than they were in the Livingston plan, in my view, in the Boris Johnson plan as well. I mean, that's a separate debate. But it does link to the whole density policy. I mean, planning, the role of planning, both at strategic and local authority level, is about meeting a range of needs, and there is a case for taking positive action to support meeting the needs of those who are most disadvantaged. And that can be family-sized households with low income. It's not just about an equal distribution of resources amongst the population as a whole. There is an issue about what needs you actually prioritise, especially when there is a shortage of capacity. And there is a shortage of development capacity, there's a shortage of land, and therefore you should be using policies to actually focus the provision on meeting the needs of those who are most disadvantaged, rather than just having basically open door to the investment market.
Can I just ask one question of, do you mind if
I'm finished.
You finished. The plan becomes live in 2019. If the boroughs don't have the area design codes and the evaluation of growth capacities and the various other planning processes that have now they've been asked to do through the London plan policies, what do you think would happen? I mean,
so what would I...
What would be the result? I mean,
firstly...
If they don't have those in place, but develop...
Well, firstly, there's the transitional period, and the difficulty you've got even before the revised London plan is adopted, that developers will actually use a published draft plan even before an examination public as a material consideration. We all know that's happened in the past. So although there basically is a kind of 2 or 3 year running before formal adoption, what the Mayor is saying begins to have an effect. It's very interesting that Borough's already saying that they're assuming the density policy goes and they're trying to work out local ways of actually maintaining or protecting quality within that context. So the Mayor has already caused massive damage in terms of policy by proposing this, in my view. But the Mayor, successive mayors, and I'm on record on saying this before, and I published a book on it even 10 years ago, the successive mayors, by not actually implementing the affordable housing and density policies, are partly responsible for how serious the problem has actually got. And I'm not making a party political point, because in my view that applies to all three mayors. If you have a policy, you stick to it. You don't just abandon it because the developers want more money.
Who's asking our last question?
I think that'll be me. What are your views on the committee's preferred option of retaining the density matrix, but with added revisions that that acknowledge different local characters, settings, typologies, and capacity for accepting denser development sustainability? Perhaps we'll go to Jacob first, and then because the two of you are sitting next to each other, are the big opponents here or the supporters of the band here. So
is it a cage fight now?
Yeah, it is indeed.
I think what's interesting about your question is that it basically, as far as I could tell, reads very similar to what the draft NPPF is saying, basically. They're basically trying to take greater account of some of the elements of it. I mean, the council's approach is that we don't agree because we want to scrap the density matrix. But I mean, I think that the challenge is that all the things that you are suggesting that we do, very similar to what the existing plan says, basically, is going to require the assessment of those sites already. Do you know what I mean? In a way, it's if you're going to have the density matrix as a thing, but then you're going to have to know the character of the site, the setting of the site, typologies that are appropriate to the site, capacity of the site for accepting dense development sustainably. That sounds like you've done a heck of a lot of work to understand the evidence base around that site already. I think the challenge with the density matrix is this extremely simple, on the surface, extremely simple thing that solves all your problems, right? It just gives you a number, it gives you an output. It takes all those things and brings them down. So I would say that instead of looking at how you can take the density take all those things, combine them into a density matrix, then try to apply things to that density matrix, you need to look backwards and think about how you can draw the density matrix back out to be something that considers more of the options, more of the elements that feed into it. I don't know if you guys looked at I'm sure you did, the previous paper where it showed the development of the density matrix. And the previous iterations of it much more clearly said, okay, this is central areas, this is transport corridors leading to them, this is suburban areas. And it looked at it in a much more kind of spatial way. And I think that is a good angle to start looking at it in terms of understanding how you might improve it. But personally, I have to stick with the council opinion that we don't support the reintroduction of the density matrix.
Mr. Levitt, what are your views on our committee's preferred option of keeping the matrix, but with revisions?
Well, it seems to be safer, the safest option, given that, as Jacob's already said, otherwise every single development to be brought forward needs to have a brief written by the local authority, and the resources simply not there to do that. In the short term, until the resource question has got answered, probably it is safer to modify the matrix, but keep it as a safeguard.
Thank you. Mr. Barry, so I'm assuming you agree with the committee that we want to keep the matrix, but what about the possible revisions that there might be in order to address some of its shortfalls?
Firstly, it's important that, people have referred to it as crude. There are obviously suburban, urban and central area categories, and I wish we'd kept the map in the London plan which actually set those out, because they relate to built form and where the local centres are. It was in the draft London plan in 2002 and was taken out for a whole range of political reasons. But that would actually return the spatial dimension that's referred to, and that can be a parameters for local authorities to work with it. When that map was dropped, local authorities were supposed to produce their own density maps. Only about 3 or 4, I think, boroughs actually did that. So, the density zones clearly have a spatial thing, and they move, of course, as public transport and centres grow and wane. But also, the matrix has got 3 different types of housing mix, just as indicators. So it doesn't necessarily say, to take... in a suburban area, it gives you different ranges depending on whether you want family homes or smaller homes. And that gives a lot of flexibility based on an assessment of need. Now, what I put in terms of the submission is that the density matrix is modified to increase the ranges in the suburban areas with high public transport. So, for example, for kind of smaller units, in a good PTAL suburban area, it would take the range up from top of the range from 130 to 185 units per hectare. It would take the over habitable rooms per hectare range up from the top from 350 to 450. So that kind of gives you the kind of incremental intensification in suburban areas with good public transport that makes some sense. And with those ranges, you can still get some family-sized homes. It doesn't mean you have to build lots of tower blocks full of small units. But my real concern is if you actually remove the policy altogether, it does mean that you're going to get hyperdensity schemes, often in local authorities because they want the planning gain from it, all for understandable reasons. But, we've got to understand what's actually happening in terms of London development. You, as I say, have a top of the range currently, 435 dwellings per hectare, but we're building schemes at 2,000 to 3,000. These schemes are not, appropriate to the local context unless you want everywhere to be like Canary Wharf. They're not meeting housing needs. So this is actually a fundamental matter of strategic importance, not just about the built form of London, but what we're developing London for. So there are other revisions. Over the years there have been attempts to change the density matrix to include the areas of the issues of congestion on public transport, where you can actually get to, the opportunities to approach that TfL was trying to develop. So the ways you can actually modify it, you could have more attempt to build into the matrix matters of where the local community centre or surgeries are there. That's primarily a local matter. City Hall could possibly do more to plot where the facilities are, where the shops are, where the pubs are. These are the kind of issues which Just Space and other groups have argued should go into the matrix, and I think that's right. But you don't want to make the matrix too complex, and as I pointed out earlier, in 2008 we changed the matrix because there were factors in the matrix that we felt were unhelpful. In other words, prioritising car parking over housing people seemed to be a bit of a mistake, which is why we took it out. The issue of saying if you build flats, you can actually build at 3 times the density than if you build houses. Whereas it should be the council deciding on the basis of housing needs what's appropriate in terms of the built form. So housing development should be driven by needs rather than actually by presumptions about built form, which are primarily based on investment profit.
Are there any other views from other panellists on whether or not we could get a density matrix but with improvements? Any
things. I think it's funny. It's interesting to kind of note, you know, from your own evidence that actually 50% of development has died away from the kind of density matrix anyway. So, you know, you wouldn't maybe call it success. Moving from one policy to the other, I think, isn't necessarily a kind of a recipe for success. I think there are lots of other issues that we've talked about. The sort of the non-application, actually, of some very good policies is a big one. My one fear about density, I think, above everything else, is that I think it's very, very numbers driven, and I think it enforces the sort of numbers driven approach rather than, as you kind of want to kind of explore more, I think, in your kind of suggestions. It doesn't have nearly enough about context, character, need and constraints. And I think what's interesting is that I don't really know where those numbers came from. You know, it feels to me that actually not enough work was sort of done, perhaps, at the sort of strategic level to really understand where the capacities were. You know, if I think about Old Oak, in many ways, you know, I think is absolutely right for a sort of very, very high density development. You're going to have the biggest station with the most capacity. You know, but then you've also got lots of constraints around railway, around roads, around bridges, around traffic, etc., which feels to me were kind of not, perhaps, kind of properly considered, you know, at the beginning. So it's a really interesting issue for me. I mean, if you're going to replace, we should keep it potentially. I think it's a very good strategic, well, it's a helpful strategic tool, but it should be balanced with these other considerations that should give you a much better sense of where that density can really be built out and where it doesn't kind of work, and maybe it needs to be more consensual with local authorities, so that the process takes a bit longer, but it's more strategic, working with the local authorities to come up with a more definitive plan. Perhaps maybe it needs a bit more detail. Otherwise, I think it just is too numbers driven, and from there everything else gets pushed beyond.
And just as a final question, do you feel that this is going to require more resources in the borough or less resources if we were to remove the density matrix? I know we touched upon it earlier, but is it going to require more work from boroughs or less work?
Yeah.
Right, because you've all got loads of resources that you can commit to that, is that right?
Well, but actually, it's not more or less. I think more resources are needed anyway to plan well. You know, it's not that you'll need less resources if you maintain a density matrix or not. It's because it doesn't replace the need to still provide, you know, solid local plans, solid local and neighbourhood plans, etc. So I think you need both. I mean, you can't. This expectation that we have a density matrix and that's sorted it all. You know, that's just the beginning, but then, unfortunately, that tends to be the beginning and the end. So I think you need more resources anyway.
Yeah, I mean, to an extent, is this a policy that's planning for a world we don't actually live in, or because if we can't commit the resources, then there's no likelihood that you are going to be able to commit the resources to do this properly. Surely, one shouldn't really put in that change, should you?
Arguably, at this point, but arguably, if you necessity is the mother of invention, isn't it? That's the crazy liberal part. We would say, you know, if you take it away, then you're going to force boroughs to make a response to it, at least, rather than just continuing with the old pattern they were going on with, which obviously is an incredible risk, and it isn't agreement generally with my thinking on this sort of thing. But I mean, you know, as I said, for Hounslow, we're already doing these significant area plans. We're trying to look at how we can do some of the characterisation stuff. If the right resources are put in place, we're confident that we could take an approach forward that didn't have a density matrix.
You had the right resources.
Yes, and it's also about structuring those resources in such a way that they work effectively. You know.
Go on, last one.
Yes, yeah. I mean, it's responding to a question somebody else raised is where did the figures actually come from? And we've got to remember there's a whole kind of long history of research behind this. I mean, the original density policy came out of research mainly by Llewellyn Davis for LPAC on the Planning Advisory Committee, which Nicky chaired at the time, before the mayoralty was established. And the 2008 review was the result of research from URS Patel Taylor, so planners and architects working together. And that's the one I was involved in commissioning. There's been 5 density reports written to support, well, to inform the debate, none of which actually recommend the abandonment of density policy and density matrix. The one report which actually came out with a recommendation was the TfL report, which actually recommended a modified form of matrix with a sort of wider assessment of transport access beyond PTAL, which I support, and to a certain extent is, I think, is the direction the committee is going in. And I think what the difficulty City Hall have had is really the only justification they've actually put forward for the change in policy is not an evidence base based on we could still get decent housing this way and the housing we need. It's been that, well, actually all the developments beyond the policy anyway, so let's drop the policy because otherwise that's constraining development, which it clearly isn't. So, I mean, I think the evidence base for the Mayor's proposal is non-existent. And as I said right at the beginning, there's a failure to understand where the density matrix and the density policy actually came from and how it was revised. And there is clearly, as we move on, there is potential for further revisions, especially on the public transport aspect, and some incremental changes in outer London to actually get closer to the housing targets. But just throwing out the baby with the bathwater seems reckless.
Thank you. I think that's going to have to be for the last one. Thank you.
Members, we've drawn this to a close. I just want to say that you may cast your mind back to January, I think it was the 22nd, but we had a meeting then. The London Plan had not long been out. We had a meeting on density and design, and some of those contributions were about how you might revise the matrix. I'm just saying, the one from Create Streets, Michael Bach, there were others as well. And so we'll put what we've gathered from this session together with that. We've also done other work on density and design in previous years, so we've got quite a body of work there. I would say that the only one of the, and we also had a whole committee on density reports, on those 4 or 5 reports that Duncan's just referred to. The only one that really begins to look at revision in the way we're talking about, I think, is the O'Varrett one, just so we bear that in mind. Anyway, this has been really, really useful. Thank you all so much for coming. And I'm not allowed to bang the gavel. I've got to... What have I got to do, Teresa?
Thank you, Chair. I'm just going to ask the committee to note the report and discussion and delegate authority to you in consultation with the Deputy Chair to agree to use the information from today's discussion as part of the committee's participation in forthcoming London Plan examination.
Thank you, Teresa, and thank you to our officers, and thank you to our members and our audience, and above all, the panel. Thank you.